Iran just told its neighbors something the entire region was waiting to hear. It said it would stop striking neighboring countries and would only launch again if attacks on Iran came from those countries. On the surface, that sounds like a climb down. It sounds like an apology, a retreat, maybe even the first real sign of de-escalation. But in wars like this, the most important word is often not the promise. It is the condition attached to the promise. Because this is not Iran saying the crisis is over, this is Iran redrawing the line. And when a government redraws the line in the middle of a war, it usually means one of two things. Either it is trying to reduce the number of enemies it is fighting at once, or it is preparing the legal and political case for its next move. That is why this moment matters so much. Not because the missiles stopped for a sentence, but because the sentence itself may tell you where this conflict goes next. The core statement is clear enough to matter and vague enough to be dangerous. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said Iran would no longer attack neighboring countries or launch missiles unless an attack on Iran originated from those countries. He also rejected calls for unconditional surrender. That is not the language of peace. It is the language of conditional restraint. It leaves room for diplomacy, but it also leaves room for escalation if Tehran decides a neighbor enabled, hosted, supported, or facilitated an attack in any way. In other words, the battlefield may be narrowing, but the trigger for expansion has not disappeared. It has just been rewritten. And that rewrite is the whole story. Because if you are a Gulf government tonight, the question is no longer only whether Iran wants to hit you. The question is what Iran will count as your involvement the next time American or Israeli operations touch Iranian territory. That is why calling this a surrender would be a mistake. Even President Trump framed Iran's message as an apology and a surrender to its neighbors. But the broader reporting does not support the idea that Iran is folded. At the same time, Pezeshkian was signaling restraint toward neighbors. Trump was publicly threatening more strikes, saying Iran would be hit very hard, and that areas and groups of people were under consideration for complete destruction. Israeli officials were also saying the campaign was far from over, and that many more targets remained. So the reality is not one side surrendering while the other side celebrates. The reality is that both sides are still speaking the language of force, but one side is also trying to split the region politically. That matters, because wars are not only fought on maps, they are fought inside coalitions, and a conditional pause directed at neighboring states can be a way of telling Gulf capitals, step back and you step out of the fire. Now ask the obvious question, why would Iran make this move now? The first answer is pressure. A week of strikes has already spilled across the Gulf. Qatar urged residents to stay indoors as the threat level rose. Qatar's foreign ministry called Iranian missile attacks a blatant violation of sovereignty and said they were inconsistent with good neighborliness. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates said they were intercepting incoming threats. Kuwait announced a precautionary cut in crude production, explicitly pointing to threats to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. This is the environment in which Tehran made its statement. So one plausible reading is simple damage control. If the goal is to stop more Gulf states from moving closer to Washington or opening more space for retaliation, then reassuring neighbors is not softness. It is strategy. It is an attempt to stop the regional front from hardening against Iran all at once. The second reason is legitimacy. Iran does not only care about surviving militarily, it cares about how the war is narrated across the region. If Tehran can say, "We are not targeting our neighbors unless they are used against us," it shifts the frame from indiscriminate retaliation to conditional self-defense. That distinction may not convince everyone, but it gives Iran a political argument it can repeat to regional audiences, international institutions, and countries sitting on the fence. That becomes especially important when civilian suffering is mounting and scrutiny is growing over the conduct of the war itself. Human Rights Watch said an attack on a primary school in southern Iran should be investigated as a war crime. NBC reported preliminary U.S. findings suggested a U.S. munition may have been responsible for that school strike, even as Trump publicly blamed Iran. In that environment, Iran has every incentive to position itself as the side narrowing the war rather than widening it. The third reason is military and economic reality. This war is not happening in a vacuum. Oil and gas markets have already been rattled. The Associated Press reported rapid rises in energy prices as the conflict disrupted major infrastructure and made the Strait of Hormuz increasingly dangerous. Kuwait cut production. Regional logistics were strained. Tanker movement through the Gulf became a major concern. If Tehran believes sustained pressure on Gulf energy arteries risks turning every neighboring state into an active enemy, then narrowing the target set becomes rational. You do not need to love your neighbors to stop giving them reasons to join the other side more openly. That does not mean Iran has become conciliatory. It means Iran may be making the oldest strategic calculation in war. Isolate the main enemy, reduce the number of secondary enemies, and keep the economic pressure high enough to matter without creating a unified bloc against you. But this is where the trap theory begins. because that same sentence that sounds like de-escalation also builds a justification for future strikes. Unless an attack on Iran originates from those countries, sounds narrow until you start unpacking what originates could mean. Does that mean aircraft physically taking off from a base inside a neighboring country? Does it include overflight permissions, shared intelligence, refueling support, missile defense cooperation, emergency basing, radar tracking, cyber support, quiet logistical assistance? That ambiguity is not accidental. Ambiguity is leverage. It lets Tehran calm the room while preserving the ability to say later that a line was crossed. If a neighboring state allows its facilities to be used or is merely accused of doing so, Iran has already planted the political language it would need to argue that renewed strikes were not a reversal, but an enforcement of its stated condition. That is why the sentence sounds gentle and sharp at the same time. There's another reason to stay cautious. Not everyone speaking for Iran is using the same tone. NBC's live reporting also quoted other Iranian voices saying countries that did not allow their territory or facilities to be used by the United States or Israel would not be targeted, while Iran's parliamentary speaker said the country's defensive policies remain unchanged, and that as long as American bases exist in the region, countries will not see peace. Those are not identical messages. They overlap, but they do not point to full de-escalation. They point to a leadership structure trying to manage multiple audiences at once, frightened neighbors, domestic hardliners, international observers, and adversaries still bombing inside Iran. When messages differ, it usually means one of two things. Either internal debate is real, or policy is intentionally layered. Neither interpretation supports a simplistic Iran backed down headline. It supports a much more complicated picture. Selective restraint paired with preserved deterrence. And that leads to the most important strategic point of all. This move may not be about peace, it may be about choice architecture. Tehran may be trying to force Gulf governments into a decision tree. If you distance yourselves from offensive operations against Iran, you reduce your own exposure. If you continue hosting or facilitating attacks, you accept that Iran may treat your territory as part of the war. That is not a peace offer in the traditional sense. It is a coercive diplomatic message. Neutrality has benefits, participation has costs. Whether that works depends on what those governments actually control and how much autonomy they have from Washington in the middle of an active conflict. But as a signaling move, it is sophisticated. It tells neighbors there is still an exit lane. It also tells the United States and Israel that regional governments might become less comfortable being visibly tied to every next strike. There is also the domestic angle inside Iran. The country is not operating under normal conditions. State media reported that clerics were preparing to introduce Iran's future leader after the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and the Assembly of Experts was moving toward a meeting on succession. Iran has also been under a prolonged internet blackout, with net blocks saying the public had been isolated without vital updates, while officials and state media retained access. When leadership transition, wartime decision-making, and information control all collide, signals to the outside world become even more strategic. A conditional halt to Gulf strikes may also be aimed inward, showing the Iranian public that the leadership can still calibrate force, still shape events, and still avoid turning every neighboring country into a permanent battlefield while succession questions remain unresolved. In unstable moments, governments often try to look both strong and disciplined at the same time. This statement does exactly that. The human reality underneath all this should not get buried under military language. NBC reported thousands of Americans remained stranded in the Middle East to even as nearly 24,000 had already returned to the United States. Dubai Airport only partially resumed operations after major disruption. Tourists described fearing for their lives when emergency alerts hit their phones. In Lebanon, displacement climbed into the hundreds of thousands. In Iran, state media put the death toll from U.S. and Israeli strikes at least 940, while strikes and counterstrikes continued across multiple countries. That is exactly why the phrase strategic retreat or trap matters beyond geopolitics. If Iran is genuinely narrowing the battlefield, even temporarily, that could save civilian lives and reduce the risk of accidental regional escalation. If it is a trap built on conditional wording and future blame, then the pause may be less a peace gesture than a repositioning before the next cycle. So how do you tell the difference? Watch behavior, not slogans. First, do strikes on Gulf territory actually fall sharply over the next several days? Second, do Gulf governments publicly limit the use of their territory for offensive operations, or do they remain operationally tied to U.S. action? Third, does Iran keep distinguishing between neighboring states and the United States, or does it widen the target set, again the moment it alleges facilitation? Fourth, do official Iranian messages converge, or do hardline voices keep signaling that the restraint is temporary or tactical? And fifth, what happens at sea and in energy infrastructure? Because if the missile rhetoric cools while commercial risk remains high, the region could still be living inside de-escalation theater rather than actual de-escalation. Real restraint changes the operational pattern, not just the press conference language. There's another subtle point here that many people miss. Retreat and trap are not opposites. Both can be true at the same time. A government can be strategically retreating from one layer of confrontation while setting conditions for leverage in the next. Iran may genuinely want fewer simultaneous enemies right now. It may also want a ready-made argument for future strikes if neighboring countries keep enabling operations against it. That is not contradiction. That is statecraft under pressure. When you are weakened, you do not always choose between stepping back and setting an ambush. Sometimes you do both. You narrow the front, regain narrative space, calm the neighbors, reduce the immediate coalition pressure, and make sure the next red line is already written in your own words. That is why this moment is so important. The sentence was short, but strategically, it does many jobs at once, and none of this means the war is cooling overall. The same live reporting that carried Pezeshkian's statement also described new strikes pounding Tehran. More than a dozen aircraft destroyed at Mehrabad Airport in satellite imagery. Israeli officials saying they had launched roughly 3,400 strikes in Iran since the start of the war, and Trump openly rejecting outside military help while insisting Iran would be hit hard. In other words, even if Gulf targeting policy becomes more selective, the central war is still expanding in intensity. That matters because a selective pause can create false confidence. Neighbors may hear, "We will no longer attack you," and mistake it for stability, when what they actually received was a heavily qualified warning during an escalating air campaign. The pressure may be shifting, not disappearing. And in conflict, shifts are often more dangerous than headlines because they change who believes they have room to act. That is also why YouTube Safe, fact-based analysis, has to resist the easiest emotional shortcut. The easy version of this story is to call it surrender, humiliation, or total collapse. The opposite easy version is to call it brilliant chess and declare that every move is part of a master trap. Both are bad analysis. What the evidence supports right now is narrower and more useful. Iran publicly signaled that it wants to reduce direct attacks on neighboring countries, but it did so with a condition broad enough to preserve escalation options. Neighboring states have real reasons to take that message seriously because they have already felt the risk. But they also have good reason not to trust it blindly because the line Iran drew depends on how it defines participation. That is the tension. That is the real story, and that is where the next chapter will be decided. If you want the cleanest way to think about it, use this framework. A retreat changes objectives. A trap changes incentives. And what we have seen so far looks more like incentive warfare than objective surrender. Tehran is trying to alter the choices of its neighbors without giving up its ability to punish them later, if it believes they cross the line. That makes the apology less important than the architecture around it. The architecture says, we can stop hitting you, but only if you stop being part of the machinery pointed at us. That is not the end of pressure. It is pressure, repackaged as conditional restraint. And the answer to whether it is sincere will come from what happens. The next time aircraft, missiles, intelligence, or basing support connected to this war passes through the neighborhood. That is when the line moves from rhetoric to test. There's one more reason this matters globally. The longer this conflict touches Gulf bases, airports, oil routes, and civilian movement, the harder it becomes to contain the economic fallout. AP reported surging oil and gas prices as the war deepened. Kuwait has already adjusted production. Civil aviation has been disrupted. Repatriation efforts are ongoing. Even a partial reduction in Gulf strikes could lower the temperature around shipping, insurance, logistics, and commercial confidence. But if this statement is only a pause before a new dispute over who facilitated what, then the market will treat the region as conditionally unstable rather than stabilizing. And conditional instability is enough to keep prices elevated, flights disrupted, and civilians on edge. That is why the diplomacy matters even when the bombing continues. In modern war, markets and families react to conditional language almost as fast as they react to explosions. So, strategic retreat or trap? Based on the evidence right now, the most honest answer is this. It is a tactical retreat in scope, and potentially a trap in wording. Iran appears to be trying to reduce the number of active regional fronts and ease pressure from neighboring states, but it has not accepted defeat, abandoned coercion, or closed the door to future strikes. It has instead created a conditional framework that could justify renewed attacks if it says a neighbor became part of the war machine aimed at Iran. That is not peace. It is a narrower and more politically sophisticated phase of conflict. The missiles may pause in one direction, but the logic of deterrence remains fully alive. And until that logic changes, every apology in this war has to be read with the fine print first. So here is the takeaway. Do not watch the headline and assume the danger is gone. Watch the condition, watch the basis. Watch the airspace, watch the next argument over who enabled which strike. Watch whether Gulf capitals try to create daylight between themselves and offensive operations. Watch whether Iranian messaging hardens or converges. And above all, watch whether the pattern of attacks actually changes. Because in a conflict this volatile, the difference between de-escalation and delayed escalation is not the promise. It is the pattern that follows. And right now, the pattern has not answered the question yet. It has only made the question more important.